Hey there, it's Jordan with Status Coup. Delighted to be joined by Professor Richard Wolff, founder of Democracy at Work. Check him out on YouTube for really, really in-depth and anti-echo chamber analysis on the economy, politics. I thought it'd be great to talk to you because right now the media is obviously focused on the midterms and what polls are showing and inflation and these things, but there's not a lot of substance underneath it. And as we talk, the Fed has announced another interest rate increase of 0.75, where essentially, I mean, there's going to be a lot of pain. Maybe there's already pain being felt due to these interest rate hikes. You have people like Larry Summers openly saying we need unemployment to go up. So I thought it would be good to talk to you. Can you kind of distill for us in a nutshell where we're at in inflation, if any change will happen, if the Democrats keep power, if the Republicans take power, and what are your thoughts on Federal Reserve Chair Powell's statements that they're going to continue doing everything they can to get inflation down to, I think it was at 2% he wants.
Right. Well, I think you've hinted at it in your opening, and I commend you for it. The people who tell us about pain are the people who don't have to suffer it in any case, and so can be quite grandiose in telling us what we do and do not need, since it will not come out of them. It never does. Larry Summers, before he shot himself in the foot, was the president of Harvard, given to saying outrageous things. That's why he isn't the president of Harvard anymore. And so I'm not surprised if he continues his career by saying things like the pain that people like him view at a distance if they notice it at all. And the same applies to Mr. Powell. His remarks about pain, extraordinary. And let's remember, before I jump into the answer, we as a nation created the Federal Reserve, which is basically the central bank of the United States. In other countries, it's called the Bank of England or the Bank of France or the Bank of Italy and so on. We once had a Bank of the U.S. It got caught up in, you guessed it, corruption. And so it was not possible and not thought wise to recreate something that had gone down in such a fog of corruption. So we call it this odd name, the Federal Reserve System, but it is the central bank. And when we created it back at the beginning of the 20th century, so it's a long existing institution, it was given two jobs. Number one, maintain price stability. That's a nice way of saying, make sure we don't have inflations. And the second job it was given 100 plus years ago was help the economy maintain full employment. What we have instead is an institution that keeps telling us that we have to choose between the one and the other. Hello, you were supposed to prevent us from ever being in that situation. You know, 3 or 4 years ago, the Federal Reserve predicted that, like the first 15 or 20 years of this century, we were not going to have an inflation, and they enjoyed taking a certain amount of credit. Not that they deserved it, because we didn't have an inflation. But now that we've had one, and it's a doozy, and it's not going away, what do we know the Federal Reserve did? It failed. It failed to prevent it. When it began in 2021 last year, we were confidently told by Mr. Powell, among others, that if we had an inflation, not to worry, it wouldn't be bad and it wouldn't last very long. I believe the word he used was transitory. Well, that was wrong too. That was a prediction that failed too. We have an inflation. It is a doozy, currently running in excess of 8%, which is the official number, and having lasted for a long time and literally being discussed now in terms of the years of higher interest rates. It'll take to years of inflation that we can foresee. Whoa. I mean, there's no reason to believe the Federal Reserve. It has, it's like flipping a coin. Sometimes it comes down the way you want, sometimes it doesn't. But to rely on it as a tool for knowing what's coming, the only person who should do that is a person who has made sure not to know any of the history of the last 50 years, and particularly the last 5. So that's the first thing. We have a serious inflation. It's in excess of 5%. The Federal Reserve now is supposed to prevent that. It failed. Well, then it's supposed to make it be short. Well, it's already failed at that. Now we have the last that's left. Get it down as soon as you can, because we don't want it. And I want to make clear, because Americans don't seem to get it. We don't want it, not because it hurts poor and middle income people. Of course it does that. That's why the Federal Reserve was supposed to prevent it from happening, because it's a horribly unfair economic problem. If prices go up 5 or 10%, for people on welfare, for people on minimum wage, for an average family trying to get by, this is a devastating problem, which millions and millions of Americans are facing in the supermarket as we speak, in the department store, at the gas station, etc. So, but that never stopped these people. That's why they didn't do the things they could have done, as I'll get to in a minute, to deal with this inflation. That it hurts poor people, that it hurts the middle class. We've been hurting poor people in the middle class for quite a while. And you know what else hurts poor people in the middle class? Raising interest rates does that. That's what the Federal Reserve is doing. It is choosing a policy, raising interest rates, to try to correct the failures of its other policies that failed to prevent the inflation. So, you know who suffers from rising interest rates? You guessed it, the poor and the middle class. Because for them, when the credit card interest rate goes up, they're stuck at the end of the month with more to pay, and they don't have it, especially because they've been hurt by the inflation. You know what else happens? The monthly payment for the car you buy on time will now be higher, because in that monthly payment is the interest rate being charged for the loan you had to take out to buy the car. We're having a meltdown of our housing industry. And let's be clear, we're a country that has, ready, millions of people that are homeless, but with a rising interest rate, the monthly cost of getting a home, whether it be owning one or renting an apartment, is going up. Yeah. So we're hurting those folks too. We have a record number of young people in America today who are living with their parents in the same household. They don't want to. They need their independence. They need the space, psychological as well as physical, but they can't, because mortgages are now over 7%, which is more than 3 times what they were a couple of years ago. So we're hurting these people in lifelong and life-changing ways. But that's not why we're doing it. We're doing it because inflation hurts profits. Oh, here we go. How does it do that? Well, if you're a company that sells goods abroad, you produce them here, but you sell them in another country. If we have an inflation here, it means all the prices are going up. That's all the word inflation means. If the prices are going up here in the US, a foreigner looking to buy something made in the United States is going to say, whoa, I'm not paying a higher price. I'm going to look elsewhere where prices are not going up and buy what I need there, not from the United States, because it's pricing itself out of the market. And you know, one of the great beneficiaries of people around the world not buying from America, you guessed it, the People's Republic of China, our major competitor. So we got to do something to kind of cope with this inflation. But that's all. Other than that, don't be confused. If you look at many American corporations, the inflation has been a time of booming profits. General Motors, Ford, Apple Computer, I could go on and on and on. They've been doing fine. You know why? Because they just keep raising prices. For them, inflation is an excuse because everybody's seeing prices go up, they hope. Nobody will notice that they're raising theirs more than the rate of inflation. You know, we have in this country a measurement called wages, right? We all live off wages and salaries. The government tells us how fast that's going up. Here's the answer over the last year, about 5%. All right, it's not rocket science, folks. If the money you get on average in your paycheck is going up 5%, but everything you have to buy in the supermarket and the gas station is going up 8%, you're falling behind. You can afford fewer things this year with your 5% more money in the envelope at the end of the week than you could last year. The prices are outrunning your wages. That's why it's so peculiarly odd, and I'm being polite here, to blame wage increases for the inflation, which businesses want to do. And they don't do that because it's accurate or it's scientific. It's the opposite. They do it to distract from what they are doing, which is using this inflation as an opportunity to make money by jacking up their prices. Last point. Sorry to talk so long, but you did ask.
No,
you did ask
a
big question, Jordan. This interest rate rise, I find it. I'm not going to mince my words. Yours is a show where you try to tell it like it is, so let me try. I'm disgusted. There's no polite way to say this. I'm disgusted. And I'm disgusted as a professional economist. I teach this material. I've studied it all my life. I know what many of my colleagues know, even though they are a little hesitant to say it. I'm not going to be. Raising interest rates is not the best way. It is not the only way. It's not the preferred way to deal with inflation. But it is treated that way by the Federal Reserve, by the leadership of both of our major political parties, by the media. It's really an amazing self-delusion that has become generalized. Let me be very clear. August 15th of 1971, the President of the United States, Richard M. Nixon, generally viewed as a conservative Republican in office. We have an inflation, even worse then than the one we have now, but a really bad one. And he gets on radio and television and he says to the American people, we have a terrible inflation. We can't let it go on any longer. Been going on for a year or two. And I'm going to take a step to stop it. And here's what I'm going to do, says conservative Republican President Nixon. As of tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, any business, factory, office, store, any business in America that raises its price at all, we will come to you, we will arrest you, and we'll throw you in jail. It is illegal, as of tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, for anyone to raise a price. And if you're a union or a worker group and you try to do that with wages, same thing. We'll come, we'll arrest you, we'll throw you in jail. The thing was, the policy he was announcing came to be called a wage price freeze, which is pretty much what it was. It was scheduled to last 90 days. It was successful. The inflation came down like a balloon that you've let the air out of, and it was extended for months beyond that. It is widely credited with enabling Mr. Nixon to win re-election. He then blew that away in the Watergate scandal, but, presidents are presidents. My point, why are we as a nation, having gone through that experience, having discovered that it is a way to stop an inflation, why are we not discussing it now? Why are even the inheritors of the conservative Republican tradition, whatever that might be, why aren't they talking about it? Why aren't we having economists like me and people who disagree with me? Let's have a debate. What are the strengths and weaknesses of a wage price freeze? It has both. But I got to tell you, raising interest rates has got lots of problems. That's why the stock market is going up and down like a yo-yo, depending on what Mr. Powell says is how high the interest rates will go, for how long these high rates will last, and everything else that have filled the financial pages the last few days. Then let's go a little bit further back in history, but it's not ancient. In the early years of the 1940s, we had another president, a Democrat, Franklin Roosevelt. And in the early 40s, he and the Congress made the decision to enter World War II. And they knew that this decision would have economic consequences. Resources that up until then had been used to produce food, clothing, gasoline, and all the things we all use would have to be diverted. Those resources wouldn't be used for consumer goods like that anymore because we needed them to be shifted over to produce for the war. Guns, bullets, tanks, uniforms, all of that. And that meant that if you shifted resources to war away from consumer goods, that you would, get ready now, have a shortage of consumer goods.
Right.
And so then the question became, because economists, I can assure you, are not only not rocket scientists, they have a hard time spelling rocket science. So here's what they did. They went to the president and they said, you got a problem, Mr. President. Because if suddenly we have a shortage of consumer goods, the way a capitalist free market system works, the mass of people are going to confront shortages of consumer goods. And you know what's going to happen? Those who have more money will go to the seller of the goods and say, I can see a shortage. I don't want to be left out. Whatever you're charging, I'll give you that plus 20%. And the person standing next to him will say, whoa, I don't want to be left out either. I'll give you whatever you're charging plus 25% just to make sure I get your first and best attention. The way we say this in economics is that the prices will go up because the shortage of supply confronts an unchanged demand. And we have to deal with that. And in a private market system, an inflation is the result. The higher demand bids up the prices of the supplies that are in short supply. But that was a devastating piece of information for President Roosevelt. Why? Because it means, to give you a graphic example, that if you're coming to the store to get a quart of milk for your young baby children, and there's a rich guy from downtown who's coming to the same store to get a quart of milk to feed his favorite pet, he's going to outbid you. And we're going to be taking care of pets while our children are crying in hunger. Long story short, inflation's hurt everybody but the richest. They don't care. They have the money. They can do the bidding. And as the price goes up and more of the poor and the middle can't afford it anymore, they'll go home with it. In other words, a free market distributes to the richest people and the rest can go. I won't finish the sentence. Mr. Roosevelt understood, you're going to fight a war, you'll never get to first base on the war because your own people will be fighting each other for the quarts of milk.
Right. I'd like to ask you, because I think part of the problem also is it's like this land of make-believe where the media reports this as if, there just seems to be a slight incongruity between the increased costs for corporations and what they're charging. I mean, look at this New York Times.
Right.
Food prices soar and so do companies' profits. Some companies and restaurants have continued to raise prices on consumers even after their own inflation-related costs have been covered.
Right.
So they twist themselves into human pretzels, not to say the phrase price gouging, because that's what's going on. I mean, it's not all of inflation, but a good chunk of it is companies are just price gouging. And
Absolutely.
we don't have, I never thought I'd defend Richard Nixon, but we don't have that Nixonian leader right now who would do that. Biden has sent letters, like harshly toned letters to the oil companies, telling them to lower prices. But there's no threat behind it. I mean,
No.
I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong. We give $15 billion a year in free money in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah.
There's no threat to pull that. Can you kind of talk about how much of this is price gouging, and why do you think, other than our government is bought, that there's no policy prescriptions really from the Democrats, we know the Republicans, to do anything about price gouging?
No, they can't even look. There is no policy. You've already explained it in a way. They can't even say in a simple English sentence what the heck is going on here. I do want to hammer, if you allow me. What Roosevelt did is he canceled the market. He wasn't going to allow an inflation. So suddenly he said, as of tomorrow, you're not going to get a quart of milk, a pound of sugar, a gallon of gasoline, loads of items. You're going to need a ration ticket. I'm going to produce in the government a ration book that has little stamped tickets in it, and you tear them off. And when you go to the store, you have to give the storekeeper one of those tickets to get a quart of milk or a gallon of gas or a pound of coffee or a pound of meat or whatever. And all of those things were included, as well as many others. If you give the storekeeper money and he gives you an object in exchange, what we call the market, we'll arrest them. We'll arrest him for breaking the law. You can't do that. You can only buy with one of the tickets. And you know how we distribute the tickets? To each according to their needs. You got a lot of little children in your family, you're going to get more milk tickets. If you're an elderly couple, you're not going to get that many milk tickets, because we didn't want the market to distribute, because it would make us fight each other. It would be so unfair, so unequal, that even Americans who look the other way about inequality most of the time, it was too much, even for us as a people. And so we had rationing. Again, does rationing have problems? Yes. So do wage price freezes. So do raising interest rates. But we debate them. Instead we have no conversation at all about this. It's a sign of a system that is so far gone that even when it can no longer hide the problems it has, it hides most of the solutions because it's afraid to have an open discussion, especially about this issue, because a discussion about how best to handle an inflation is liable to spread to ask the really good questions you're asking about why we have this problem. To answer your particular question, it is impossible to answer the gouging is 54% of the problem. And here's why. Even if when a company says we have to raise our prices, let's say 6% to cover the higher cost of our inputs, and then on top of that, we don't just stop at 6, we load on another 6, so we raise it 12%. You might be tempted to say, well, half of it is gouging. No, much more of it is, because when they say I have to pay more for my inputs, here's what they're saying to us. I'm going to jack up my prices because other employers, just like me, jacked up theirs. Wait a minute. We're going to allow the inflation to be excused because one employer blames the next employer? This is being hustled with a 3-card Monte on the streets of Tennessee. I mean, what in the world is going on here is a kind of hustle. It's embarrassing. For me, it's embarrassing to watch economists, some of whom I know personally, and many of whom were educated in the exact same economics classes right up to the PhD as I was. That's why they know me and I know them personally. I know they know better than this. I was in the classroom when we were both taught this, and yet I see them speaking on press conferences and advising Mr. Powell and being in Mr. Powell's shoes, which one of my classmates was until recently. Wow, this is a kind of a collective refusal to face reality. And I want everyone to think what I just said, because a government as disconnected from the reality of its economic problems that are shaking this system, you begin to have to worry and wonder what illusions are governing their relationships to China these days, the Ukraine war these days, the deteriorating relationship with Europe these days. All of these interconnected issues are beginning to produce a politics of fantasy, of make-believe, of self-delusion. I think that's the serious thing we have to take from this spectacle.
Right. And let me ask you, I mean, obviously, we're not expecting much better if Republicans expected to take over the House, possibly the Senate, who knows? But I don't particularly see any reason to think this inflation is going to come down significantly in the next 6 months to a year. I mean, they could keep jacking up interest rates, but there's no criminal penalty for these corporations. Like you said, there's no real negatives for them to keep doing this. We can't even push legislation to prohibit stock buybacks past a certain threshold of profit. So where is the off ramp? I mean, Jerome Powell seems to think if we just lay off enough people, that's what's going to happen as interest rates continue to go up further and further, companies are going to start laying people off. He seems to think that will lower prices, but if companies are seeing, hey, Exxon just made $19 billion last quarter in profits, why would we think inflation is dramatically going to go down?
Exactly. And I always turn to history. I mean, for me, that's all we have is our history. Try to understand what did we do the last time we were in a fix like this, what worked, what didn't work. You try to puzzle and make an adjustment for the conditions having changed. So let me give you an answer to your question. There is absolutely no reason to believe that Republicans have one iota of a difference. Let's also remember, Mr. Powell, the head of the Fed, he is a Republican. He was put there, by a Democrat, if my memory is correct, but it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Whether he's there, whether Janet Yellen is there, one of the others, they're all dancing to the same music that isn't playing. And that's the real problem. Number two.
He was appointed by Trump, by the way, and Biden decided to keep him. So
okay, same, exactly. I rest my case, exactly. Here's another piece of historical evidence you might want to think about. Have we tried to stop inflations in the past by raising interest rates? Yes, we have. Did they prove to be a panacea, a solution? Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. When they did, are we sure it was that, not other things going on at the time? No, I've done that statistical work. So it's a policy. It may work. It often doesn't work. And we have a name for what happens if you raise interest rates. Therefore, people can't borrow the way they did before. They can't afford to borrow anymore, individuals and businesses. That's the whole point of raising interest rates. And so if they can't borrow more, they can't spend as much because they haven't got the borrowed money to do it. And with less goods being purchased, workers will get laid off. But the hope is that the companies, now with fewer workers, now with producing less because they can't sell, will be less likely to raise prices. That's the logic. That's why raising interest rates is a, quote, solution to an inflation. Has it happened that we've raised interest rates? People got laid off, less is produced, all of that happens, but the inflation doesn't stop. Absolutely has happened many times. We have a word in economics for it. It's called stagflation. And it's those two words, stagnant economy and inflation, smushed together. So we get stagflation. It's when you have rising unemployment and the prices don't stop going up. You have, if you like, the worst of all worlds, a capitalist system unable to put people to work, unable to solve its homeless problem, and unable to solve inflation, all going on at the same time. And right now we have the best example in the automobile industry. we are producing about 20% fewer cars, new cars, this year than in the last year before the pandemic. We're not going back to the way things were. The car companies have raised their prices enormously. Average car sold today in America, $48,000. You know what's happened? We have decided, or rather we, the automobile companies have decided they can make more profit jacking up the price of fewer cars than they could make by having more cars, but in order to sell them, to bring the price down. We allow them, employers are 1% of the American people. Employees, that's the other 99%. We allow 1% of the people, the employers of America, to decide that it's in their profit interest to have less production, fewer people working with all the suffering that means, higher prices, so much higher that profits end up going up, because even though they're producing and selling fewer cars, they're doing it at a higher enough price per car to come out ahead. They win, they announce their wonderful profits, and the rest of us are scratching our heads looking at an inflation that hasn't stopped and unemployment that's going up. You know what would be the honest assessment of an economic system that works like this? It's what we do when we give a grade called an F. F for failure. This is an economic system that isn't working for anyone other than the 1%.
Absolutely. And my last question to you is, I think that in these midterm elections and presidential elections, you have a lot of high-minded, hoity-toity talk, saving democracy, threats of fascism, and there's validity to some of that. But at the end of the day, I mean, we have an income inequality that has skyrocketed over the last 40 years. Wages are essentially flat. I mean, when you couple inflation and people are growing more and more desperate, and that desperation, in my view, is good breeding ground for people like Trump, for these authoritarian type leaders. Other than the economics, what is the threat here if we're going to continue to provide neoliberal crumbs for the people, a $1,400 check, unemployment, the Inflation Reduction Act, which doesn't really do anything on inflation, will give you some tax incentives. When you're not actually providing any structural relief to the masses, do you feel that actually is a risk to sending more people into this rightward shift of authoritarianism, election denial, and kind of culture wars?
Absolutely. And let me once again illustrate why history is the teacher. The American working class, the vast majority of us that get wages and salaries and work Monday to Friday and all of that, you look at that work, that part of our population, overwhelming majority. And here's what I see. For the last 30 to 40 years, an enormous redistribution of wealth from the bottom and the middle to the top. Everyone sees it. The statistics are obvious. The inequality, and it doesn't stop. It's going on as I talk to you. That's a long run squeeze of the working class. Then we have three crashes in this new century. The dot-com crash in 2000, the subprime mortgage crash in 2008, and now the so-called COVID-19 crash. Three crashes in 20 years in which millions lose their job, millions use up whatever little savings they have, millions go into more debt than they ever imagined and can ever pay back, leading them to have a life of anxiety. And then we hit them with a terribly inadequate response to COVID-19. And as if these body blows economically weren't enough, we now hit them with an inflation, and now we hit them with an increase in interest rate. It's too much. You have imposed on your working class a level of decline of the end of the American dream, the end of the dream for the children to look forward to. And it's all in a relatively short amount of time. People go crazy when you do that to them on this scale. And the example is Germany. In 1918, Germany lost World War I. No one prepared them for that, just like no one prepared the American working class to be hammered the way it has in the last 30 years. And then when the war is over and they've lost, they can't cope with what happened. Where was the German Empire? Where was the great success of Germany that they'd been hearing about? But before they could even figure that out, they get to 1923. You want to hear about an inflation? In Germany, prices doubled every hour for weeks and months on end. All the savings of a very frugal German working class, my family's partly German, they saved everything. Those were worth nothing. Within a matter of weeks, the savings of a generation or three were enough money to buy a pound of butter. And then in 1929, the Great Depression hits them. It's too much. You subjected the German working class to a level of crunching down and hurting and deprivation and difficulty and anxiety. So these very sober people turned to a short little guy who wasn't a German, an Austrian with a funny little black mustache, who was politically not just from the right wing, but from outer space right wing, a fascist, a Nazi, etc. And they gave him their support, and he ruined everything and lost another war. But that's the hint. We're watching almost as if it were in slow motion, the same abuse of your working class in the desperate effort to make money and profit for a few. And it's going to come back, and it's already shaking our society. For me, it's almost a plea that I make when I speak publicly now. Look at the history, look at the parallels. Don't let this economic system continue, because it will, as Hitler's did, not only collapse and fail, but take the whole society down with it. That's what has to be held back. That's what we're watching in slow motion. And my fear is that the need not to see it, not to face it, is going to blind us to something we could have changed, but we didn't.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Wolff, for the nitty-gritty on inflation, history, and all things economics. Democracy at Work. Check them out on YouTube, and we'll stay in touch.
Let me say one thing to your audience. What I'm pleading for is the kinds of conversation that we just had. Your program, you're doing this, and I can attest. I didn't tell you I was going to say this, but you are providing a very important antidote to everything I just said. I don't want people to leave depressed at the implications of what I'm saying. Yeah, think about it. But we're seeing voices like yours begin to demand and to explore other ways of dealing with the world. That's the hope we have.
Thanks so much. Appreciate that.